Welcome to another video, and thanks again for stopping by. If you like this video and the content we produce on this channel, please consider supporting us by subscribing to the channel. Please like the video and share it on social media. Let's get into the video. Canada's history is a long and complex one that begins with the arrival of Europeans to the continent in the 15th and 16th centuries. Over the course of the next several centuries, Canada would go through a series of transformations and changes as it developed into the country that we know today. In this video, we will explore a brief history of Canada, from its early colonial period up until 1982, when the Canadian Constitution was repatriated. The early colonial period, 1497 to 1763. The first European to explore what is now Canada was the Italian explorer Giovanni Caboto, also known as John Cabot, who sailed under the English flag in 1497. Caboto claimed the land for England, but it was the French who established the first permanent settlement in Canada in 1608. Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City in that year, and it became the center of France's colonial efforts in North America. The French established fur trading posts throughout the region and developed a strong trading relationship with the First Nations people who lived there. Meanwhile, the British also established settlements in what is now Canada. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht gave the British control of Newfoundland, and in 1757, the British defeated the French in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, which gave them control of Quebec. This was followed by the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which formally ended the 7 Years' War and gave the British control of most of what is now Canada. The formation of Canada, 1763 to 1867. With the British in control of Canada, the next several decades were marked by efforts to develop the country and to create a sense of national identity. The British North America Act, now the Constitution Act, was passed in 1867, which established the Dominion of Canada, a confederation of 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. The goal was to allow the provinces to come under one umbrella, as well as allowing Canada to take more control over its affairs and its defense. Following the establishment of the Act, Canada had its first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald. Another notable event that happened during this period was the War of 1812. The War of 1812 between America and Canada, then controlled by the United Kingdom, was primarily fought over maritime and trade issues, as well as disputes over the US-Canada border. Some of the major causes of the war included the impressment of American sailors into the British Navy, British restrictions on American trade, and British support for Native American resistance against US expansion into the Northwest Territory. The war began in June 1812 when the United States declared war on Britain. Early battles were fought in Canada, but the US forces were unable to capture territory and suffered a number of defeats. Later in the war, the British blockaded the US coast, and the US suffered significant losses, including the burning of the White House in Washington, D.C. The war ended in 1815 with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which restored pre-war boundaries and settled most outstanding issues between the two countries. The war is often considered a draw, as neither side achieved a clear victory. In the years that followed, Canada would further expand its land acquisition efforts. In 1869, the Hudson's Bay Company sold Rupert's Land, a vast area of land covering northern Quebec, northern Ontario, much of the 3 Prairie provinces, and most of southern Nunavut, to Canada for $1.5 million, notwithstanding the Indigenous people living on the land holding land titles. The sale, however, was not an easy decision for the company, as the Americans had made them a much higher offer to purchase the land, following an acquisition of Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. This was because the British government had made it clear that it only wanted the land to be sold to Canada. This was followed by the purchase of the Northwest Territories in 1870 and the acquisition of British Columbia in 1871. Canada's economy also began to grow rapidly during this period, as the country became a major exporter of agricultural goods and natural resources like lumber, coal, and minerals. This economic growth led to increased immigration to Canada, with large numbers of people coming from Europe to settle in the country. This economic growth era was, however, marred by some periods of darkness in Canada's history. One of these periods was the Canadian residential school system. The Canadian residential school system was a dark period in Canadian history that lasted over a century, from the 1870s to the late 1990s. During this time, the Canadian government operated a network of residential schools that were designed to assimilate Indigenous children into Canadian culture and eradicate their language, traditions, and way of life. The residential school system was run by various Christian denominations and the federal government. Indigenous children were taken from their families and communities and forced to attend these schools where they were forbidden from speaking their native languages and punished if they did. They were also subjected to physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, and many children died from disease, neglect, or abuse while at the school. The impact of the residential school system on Indigenous communities has been devastating and far-reaching. Many survivors suffer from intergenerational trauma, and the loss of language, culture, and family connections has had a profound effect on Indigenous people's identity and sense of self. The Canadian government officially apologized for the residential school system in 2008, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to document the experiences of survivors and their families. The Commission's final reports, released in 2015, included 94 calls to action to address the ongoing legacy of the residential school system and work towards reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. The World Wars and Beyond, 1914 to 1982. Canada's involvement in the First World War marked a turning point in the country's history. Canada's contribution to the war effort was significant, with more than 600,000 Canadians serving in the military and more than 60,000 losing their lives. This helped to establish Canada as a significant player on the world stage. Canada's involvement in the Second World War was even more significant. Canada declared war on Germany in 1939, and by the end of the war, more than 1 million Canadians had served in the military. Canada played a major role in the Allied victory, and the country's military, economic, and political power grew significantly as a result. In the post-war period, Canada continued to grow and change. The country became more diverse, with immigration from all parts of the world increasing. This diversity was reflected in changes to Canada's policies and institutions, as the government sought to address issues like discrimination and inequality. Canada continued its growth, demonstrating its ability to be an active participant in many international organizations, including the United Nations, UN, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the World Trade Organization, WTO, and the G7 and the G20. As a founding member of the UN, Canada has played an important role in shaping the organization's policies and initiatives. Canada has also contributed to many UN peacekeeping missions around the world and has been recognized as a leader in this area. One of the most significant events in Canada's history came in 1982 when the Canadian Constitution was repatriated. This meant that Canada no longer had to go to the British government to amend its constitution. In that same breath, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was created, giving Canada greater independence and autonomy from Britain, and affirmed the rights of all Canadians under the law.